Before, he'd felt like another voiceless kid being talked over in a courtroom where everyone seemed to have already decided his fate. Now, they had no choice but to listen. Leaning forward, Judge Dunham rested her elbows on the bench. "While we wait for that request, Kendrick," she said evenly, "I want you to walk us through exactly what happened that night." Every detail. Kendrick's mouth went dry, but he nodded. "The night I got arrested," he began, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I was heading home. I wasn't running. I wasn't looking over my shoulder. I didn't even see them until they pulled up behind me. They asked where I was going, what was in my pockets. I told them nothing. I told them I hadn't done anything wrong." He paused, his hands clenching together in his lap. Cowell was watching him now, but Kendrick refused to meet his gaze. That's when Cowell grabbed me. I pulled back, not because I was fighting, but because I was scared. Then Denton shoved me against the wall, telling me to stop resisting. The defense attorney exhaled sharply, likely preparing to object, but Judge Dunham raised a hand, cutting him off before he could speak. Kendrick pressed on, his voice unwavering. "I told them I wasn't resisting. I said it over and over. It didn't matter. That's when I felt it. A punch, not a push, not an accident. Hard enough to knock the air out of me." He shifted slightly in his chair, the memory of pain still fresh. "I couldn't breathe. They said I was lucky they were in a good mood. Then they cuffed me and put me in the car. Denton said something." Kendrick finally looked at Cowell, his expression resolute. "He told me I could talk all I wanted, but in the end, people like me never win." The courtroom fell silent. Even the stenographer stopped typing, the only sound the faint hum of tension in the air. Judge Dunham studied Cowell intently. "Officer Cowell," she said, her voice sharp, "did you have your body cam on during this arrest?" Cowell exhaled through his nose, his expression blank. "Standard procedure is to activate body cams during public interactions," he replied evasively. "That wasn't my question," Judge Dunham countered, her eyes narrowing. Before Cowell could respond, his attorney leaned forward. "Your Honor, we won't be answering any further questions until we've reviewed the footage ourselves." Of course, Kendrick thought bitterly, because they already knew what the footage would or wouldn't show. This was the moment he could choose to step back, let them bury the truth as they always did. Or he could keep pushing forward. Swallowing hard, he forced his voice to stay steady. "If that footage is gone," he said, his words cutting through the tension, "it's because they don't want you to see it." Cowell's jaw twitched. Hollowell glanced between Kendrick and the officer, her lips pressing into a thin line as pieces clicked into place in her mind. Judge Dunham tapped a finger against her desk, her gaze flicking to Kendrick. "In the meantime, son, is there anything else you want to say?" Kendrick thought about that night. The rough brick scraping against his cheek, the crushing weight of a boot on his back, the mocking laughter as he gasped for air. And then, the moment they shoved him into the car, Cowell casually turning off the camera. Looking directly at the judge, he answered simply, "No. I think I've said enough." But deep down, Kendrick knew the truth had only begun to surface. The atmosphere in the room shifted, heavier now, as if the weight of his words had settled over everyone, making it impossible to ignore what had been laid bare. For a long moment, Judge Dunham sat motionless. Then she exhaled and turned to the prosecution. "Miss Hollowell, how long will it take to retrieve the footage?" Hollowell exchanged a quick glance with one of her aides, who typed furiously on a laptop. After a few seconds, the aide whispered something in her ear. Hollowell's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your Honor," she said carefully, "according to the department's logs, Officer Cowell's body cam footage from that night is missing." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Kendrick's stomach twisted, not from surprise but from the confirmation of what he already suspected. This was how it always played out. Judge Dunham's expression remained inscrutable. "Missing?" Hollowell gave a slow nod. "There's a report stating his camera malfunctioned during the arrest and was later found to be corrupted." Kendrick let out a bitter breath, shaking his head. Sensing an opening, the defense attorney straightened his tie and addressed the judge. Your Honor, this is precisely why we shouldn't accept accusations like these at face value. Without hard evidence, we're left with mere speculation. Kendrick had heard enough. You don't need a video, he burst out, his voice rising above the murmurs. Just look at me. The defense attorney whirled around, irritation flashing across his face. Excuse me? Judge Dunham's fingers drummed a steady, deliberate rhythm on the surface of her desk. The sound echoed faintly in the tense courtroom air. Hollowell cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Your Honor, she began, her voice firm and measured. I'd like to move for an immediate internal review of Officer Callowell's conduct, including a forensic examination of any available dashcam footage or third-party recordings from the area that night. The defense attorney scoffed audibly, his tone dripping with disdain. This is turning into a circus. We don't even know if those injuries are from the night of the arrest. Kendrick clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He was tired of watching men in suits twist words, sidestep truths, and spin narratives until the case wasn't about what happened at all, but rather how well they could deny it. Just as it seemed the proceedings would drown in technicalities, a voice cut through the tension from the back of the room. I saw what happened. Every head turned. A man stood near the entrance, hesitant, yet resolute. Mid-40s, dark-skinned, with eyes weighed down by exhaustion, he locked gazes first with Kendrick, then with Judge Dunham. I was there that night, he continued, his voice unwavering. I saw the cops stop that boy, and I saw what they did. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The defense attorney immediately objected. Callowell stiffened in his seat, and Hollowell spun around, signaling her team to verify the man's identity. But Kendrick simply stared, struck by the realization that, for the first time since this ordeal began, he wasn't alone, and that changed everything. Kendrick barely breathed as the man remained rooted at the back of the room, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn bomber jacket. He glanced around nervously, perhaps second-guessing whether he should have spoken up at all. Judge Dunham broke the silence first. State your name, she commanded, her tone neutral but commanding. The man hesitated before exhaling slowly. Reggie Samuels. The name meant nothing to Kendrick, but the subtle shift in Callowell's posture spoke volumes. Hollowell straightened abruptly, rifling through her files. Mr. Samuels, she pressed. Are you saying you witnessed Kendrick Stokes' arrest? Reggie gave a single, definitive nod. I live on that block. I was walking home from my sister's house when I saw the police pull up on him. The defense attorney groaned, rubbing his temples. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We can't just accept the word of some random bystander who… Dunham raised a hand, cutting him off. Let him speak. The room stilled once more. Reggie cleared his throat, gathering his thoughts. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cops stop kids all the time, right? But then, I saw how they handled him. His voice tightened with emotion. They weren't talking to him like a kid. They were talking down to him, like they'd already decided he was guilty of something. Kendrick swallowed hard. This part hadn't been the worst of it. I saw one of them grab him, Reggie continued. The kid barely pulled back, barely moved at all, and the next thing I knew they had him slammed against the wall. Hollowell stepped closer, her expression intent. Did you see them strike him? Reggie hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, one of them. His gaze flickered toward Callowell, his jaw tightening. All eyes followed his line of sight. Callowell didn't flinch outwardly, but Kendrick noticed the telltale signs, the clench of his jaw, the way his fingers curled tightly into his pant leg. Hollowell turned back to Reggie, her tone grave. And you're willing to testify to this under oath? Reggie took another deep breath, as if bracing himself for what came next. I'll swear on whatever you need me to, he said finally, his voice steady despite the weight of his declaration. The courtroom exploded again. Murmurs, gasps, shifting bodies. What had started as an accusation now felt like a reckoning. The defense attorney threw up his hands in exasperation. This is absurd. Some guy off the street suddenly remembers witnessing police misconduct months later. Your Honor, this is completely out of hand. Dunham's gaze hardened, silencing the room once more. She turned to Hollowell. Can we verify Mr. Samuel's presence at the scene that night? Hollowell's aide was already typing furiously on a laptop. After a moment, the prosecutor leaned in, whispering something to Hollowell. Her expression shifted subtly before she addressed the judge. Your Honor, according to city surveillance records, Mr. Samuel's cell phone was pinged near the scene of the arrest that night. Additionally, she turned sharply to Callowell. Dash cam footage from another patrol vehicle confirms he was present, standing across the street. Kendrick's heart thundered in his chest. This was it. There was no ignoring this now. Judge Dunham leaned back, exhaling slowly. Mr. Samuels, you will be added to the witness list. We will reconvene after a full review of all available evidence. She turned to Callowell, her tone unyielding. Officer Callow, you are now under formal investigation. For the first time, Callowell looked genuinely uneasy, because he knew the truth was catching up to him, and there was nowhere left to run. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. For so long, Kendrick had felt like a kid trapped in a system that had already made its judgments based on his age, his skin color, and the neighborhood he called home. But now, for the first time, it wasn't just his word against theirs. Judge Dunham tapped a pen against her desk, her expression inscrutable. We'll take a recess while both sides review the new testimony and additional footage. She turned to Kendrick. Mr. Stokes, you may step down. He hesitated, still gripping the wooden table, his knuckles white. The judge had said his name, not as a number, not as a statistic, but as a person. Nodding once, he slid back into his chair beside Miss Lowry, his guardian. Across the room, Callowell sat rigid, his hands clasped together, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Probably damage control. Kendrick wasn't naive. Even if the court ruled in his favor, justice for someone like Callowell wouldn't look the same as it did for someone like him. Systems were built to protect people like Callowell, layers upon layers of insulation shielding them from accountability. But that didn't mean they could walk away unscathed. And that's what Kendrick held on to. When the recess ended, the courtroom fell silent once more as Judge Dunham returned to her seat. Court is now back in session, she announced. Hollowell rose, her demeanor calm but resolute. Your Honor, after reviewing the new testimony and evidence, the prosecution is officially recommending that the charges against Mr. Stokes be dropped. A murmur rippled through the room. The defense attorney's mouth tightened, but he offered no objection, likely realizing there was nothing left to argue. Judge Dunham turned to Kendrick. Mr. Stokes, as of now, you are no longer facing charges. Your case is dismissed. Kendrick felt his chest tighten. It was over, but the judge wasn't finished. She shifted her focus to Callowell. Furthermore, due to discrepancies in the arrest report and the now missing body cam footage, I am ordering an independent inquiry into Officers Callowell and Denton's conduct that night. Callowell's jaw clenched. An internal review meant investigations, hearings, possible suspensions, more than just bad press. Denton wasn't even present to defend himself, and Kendrick knew why. Officer Callowell, Judge Dunham said sharply, do you have anything to say? Callowell hesitated, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. But ultimately, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Judge Dunham nodded once. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck the desk with finality. Kendrick sat motionless as people began to rise, murmurs growing louder around him. Relief should have washed over him, and maybe it did. But mostly, he just felt weary. Miss Lowry squeezed his shoulder gently. Let's go home, she said softly. He stood, glancing once more at Callowell. The officer avoided his gaze. Freedom still felt distant. Kendrick knew this wasn't the end. For every case like his, hundreds never made it this far. But today, he had won. And that mattered. Too many people went their entire lives without ever being believed, without ever getting the chance to prove the truth. Kendrick had gotten his chance, but how many others didn't? The justice system wasn't designed for kids like him. But that didn't mean they should remain silent. If stories like Kendrick's needed to be heard, if voices like his deserved amplification, then share this video. Let it remind us all that sometimes the only thing stronger than power is the truth. They had warned him. No one would believe him. But today, standing before a judge, Kendrick Stokes wasn't going to stay silent any longer. The courtroom buzzed with the usual monotony. Papers shuffled, pens scratched against legal pads, and attorneys exchanged last-minute whispers in hushed tones. It was shaping up to be just another day, a routine juvenile case, another procedural shuffle, another boy swallowed by the system. Then Kendrick spoke. His voice was steady, but his words hit like a thunderclap. "The cops beat me." For a moment, the air froze, as if even the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead had paused their hum. Judge Marianne Dunham sat motionless, her gavel resting near her fingertips. Known for her unflappable demeanor, she rarely reacted to outbursts, but this time was different. Her sharp gaze locked onto Kendrick's face, searching it for something the cold mechanics of the justice system often overlooked. Pain, fear, and beneath it all, an unyielding determination. Across the room, Officer Brent Callowell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was the officer who had arrested Kendrick, and now his jaw tightened as he avoided meeting the boy's eyes. The defense attorney, a sharp man with streaks of silver at his temples, leaned forward, lips parted, perhaps to object or dismiss Kendrick's claim as yet another desperate plea from a frightened kid. But he hesitated, because Kendrick wasn't crying. He wasn't faltering. Instead, he stared straight ahead, at the judge, at the prosecution's table. Assistant District Attorney Dana Hollowell set her pen down, not casually, but deliberately, signaling that for the first time, she was truly listening. Beside Kendrick, Miss Bernice Lowry, his guardian, gripped the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had told him not to say anything, that speaking out would only make things worse, that it was safer to let the lawyers handle everything. Yet here they were, and Kendrick's words hung heavy in the air. "Kendrick," Judge Dunham said finally, her voice calm but commanding. "Repeat that." Kendrick swallowed hard, his small hands clenched into fists on the worn wooden table. His knuckles blanched under the strain, but his voice didn't waver. "The cops beat me." Somewhere behind him, a court officer cleared his throat, an awkward, jarring sound in the suffocating silence. Judge Dunham glanced toward the prosecution. "Miss Hollowell," she asked, "was this mentioned in the reports?" Hollowell pursed her lips, glancing down at the file before her. It was standard fare, vague details, nothing unusual. But now, looking at Kendrick, the bruise peeking out beneath his oversized dress shirt, the tension in his shoulders, she saw him differently. There was no mention of excessive force in the report. "Your Honor," she began carefully, "there is no record of such allegations." Judge Dunham turned back to Kendrick. "You're saying the arresting officers used force against you?" Kendrick nodded, his gaze flickering briefly toward Callowell, who shifted again in his seat. Kendrick noticed. So did Judge Dunham. "I'm saying," Kendrick continued, his voice quieter now but still clear, "that they didn't want me to talk about it." The tension in the room thickened. No one moved. No one dared. Finally, the defense attorney found his voice. "Objection, Your Honor." "Overruled," Judge Dunham replied immediately, her focus unwavering. Something told her this was far from over. Kendrick exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the table until they ached. He knew what came next, the part where adults twisted his words, made him feel crazy, dismissed him as a liar. But he refused to back down. He looked at the judge, meeting her gaze head-on. She hadn't dismissed him yet, and that meant something. Taking a deep breath, Kendrick recounted the night it happened. It had been late, too late for a kid to be out. But he hadn't been doing anything wrong. Just walking home from his friend DeAndre's house after losing track of time playing video games. The shortcut through the alley was familiar, safe even. Or so he thought. Then came the red and blue lights flashing behind him, the slow crawl of the cruiser pulling to a stop. Kendrick froze. Hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets, alone on an empty street. He knew how this looked. Two officers stepped out. Callowell and Riley Denton, taller and older, the kind who carried authority like a weapon. Kendrick pulled his hands from his pockets immediately, palms spread wide. "Hey kid," Callowell said, feigning familiarity. "Where you coming from?" "Home," Kendrick lied. He didn't want to drag DeAndre into this, didn't want to risk another family getting dragged into the mess. Callowell didn't look convinced. "What's in your pockets? You mind if we check?" Kendrick hesitated. He knew his rights, or at least parts of them. Saying no never really worked when it came to people like them. Still, he took a step back. "I didn't do anything." Denton sighed, shaking his head. "See, I don't like that," he muttered, as though Kendrick had personally insulted him. Panic shot through Kendrick's chest as Callowell grabbed his wrist, twisting it painfully. Kendrick instinctively tried to pull away, but Callowell's grip only tightened. "Now you're resisting," Callowell growled. "I'm not." Before Kendrick could protest further, Denton shoved him against the wall. Cold bricks scraped against his cheek as a hand pressed hard against the back of his head. "Stop resisting," Denton snarled, driving a fist into Kendrick's ribs. Pain exploded through his side, leaving him gasping for air. This wasn't about questions anymore, it was about control. Each blow was measured, precise, designed to hurt without leaving evidence where it mattered most. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. Callowell straightened, smoothing his uniform. "You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight," he muttered, snapping handcuffs around Kendrick's wrists. They didn't even tell him what he was being charged with. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, Kendrick understood one thing clearly. No one would believe him. But today, in the courtroom, they had no choice but to listen. When Kendrick finished speaking, the room felt suspended in time. The faint scratching of the stenographer's keys and the distant hum of traffic outside barely registered. All eyes were on him. Judge Dunham tapped her fingers against her desk, considering. She'd seen plenty of kids lie to save themselves, others stumble over half-truths born of fear. But Kendrick wasn't stumbling. He wasn't scrambling for words. He was remembering. Prosecutor Dana Hollowell folded her arms, her gaze shifting between Kendrick and Callowell. She'd handled cases like this before. Bruises that didn't match the reports, patrol cameras conveniently malfunctioning at critical moments, power wielded like a weapon. Still, believing a child's word over an officer's wasn't simple. The silence stretched taut. Finally, Callowell cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his tone level and controlled. "This is completely untrue." His attorney nodded along. "We can't allow wild accusations like this. If the boy was mistreated, why wasn't it brought up sooner?" The accusation stung, but Kendrick remained still. He expected this. They always counted on kids like him staying quiet, but Kendrick wasn't staying quiet anymore. "You're saying he made this up?" Judge Dunham asked, her eyes narrowing on Callowell. "I'm saying there's no record of any excessive force," Callowell replied smoothly. "And I find it odd that he's only bringing it up now." Kendrick's fingers curled tighter into his sleeves. Of course there was no record. They depended on that. But Kendrick wasn't backing down. Not today. "You want a reason?" Kendrick said, his voice cutting through the room like steel. His voice remained calm, though his chest tightened with the weight of what he was about to say. They had told him no one would believe him. Those words echoed in his mind like a prophecy meant to silence him. Cowell's face betrayed nothing, not even a flicker of emotion. Kendrick didn't look at him. Instead, his eyes locked onto the judge as they led him toward the car. "They said I could say whatever I wanted," Kendrick began, his tone measured but heavy with meaning. "But they also made it clear that my word wouldn't matter against theirs." Cowell's lawyer let out a small, dismissive laugh, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is becoming absurd," he interjected smoothly. "We can't just—" "Did you file a complaint?" Hollowell cut in sharply, her gaze piercing. Kendrick hesitated, the question hanging between them like an accusation. "I didn't know how," he admitted quietly. "And even if I did, who was I supposed to tell? The cops?" A tense silence fell over the room. Coel's jaw clenched, his hands flexing against his thighs as he forced himself to remain composed. Hollowell exhaled slowly, her eyes shifting toward Judge Dunham. "Your Honor," she said firmly, "I request access to all available body cam footage from the night of Kendrick's arrest." Kendrick's stomach churned at the mention of the footage. He didn't know what it might show, or whether it existed at all. Cameras sometimes malfunctioned or were accidentally switched off, a fact he knew too well. But if the footage was missing entirely, its absence would speak louder than any testimony ever could. Judge Dunham nodded once. Motion granted. Kendrick barely breathed, feeling Coel's unreadable, calculating gaze on him. No matter what the footage revealed, or failed to reveal, this wasn't over. With that single request for body cam footage, Kendrick had changed the game.